Animals and trains have a strange relationship. On one hand, trains could be used to carry animals to places like circus shows, and then on the other, stop, we get the idea. Now, to say trains, more specifically container trains, are efficient would be a crazy understatement. They're flexible, as in being easily transferable between rail, road, and even sea, and depending on configuration, they can carry literally almost anything. Keyword being almost. Now, before the widespread use of containers, these things were the kings of the rails, hauling everything from vehicles to grain, and even live animals. These days, if you're driving down the highway, you may see 18-wheelers carrying pigs or some sort of other livestock to a laughter house. I really don't know if you can get demonetized on YouTube for saying in the first minute of the video, so we're just gonna call it a laughter house. You're probably wondering why you don't see livestock being moved by rail anymore. Well, grab some popcorn, hit a blinker, sit back and relax, cause in this video, we're gonna yap about the cattle car. Now, the idea of moving animals by rail goes back to the 1830s. At first, it was either general-purpose boxcars, sometimes modified with slats so animals could breathe inside, or open-air gondolas. I'm sure the gondola method didn't last too long. Cows aren't that stupid, and horses are pretty smart. I'm sure there were a lot of instances where animals would figure out how to jump out of the gondolas while moving. The boxcars were more safe and efficient by a long shot. Now, moving into the early 1900s, cars were equipped with movable platforms inside to adjust for bigger or smaller animals like pigs, sheep, or chickens. In the earlier days like the late 1800s, the stock cars were noticeably shorter than the usual boxcar. They ranged over the years from just under 28 feet to 36 feet, rather than the standard 40. Now, like most things back in those days, safety was about as important as it is today with the profits first mentality. Not because of corporate greed or anything, just the fact that a lot of safety stuff we use today wasn't standard, maybe not even invented yet. The cars were barren at first inside, but after many complaints of the poor living conditions for animals on board, partitions to reduce trampling of different animals, and feed and water troughs were added to make the travel a little more enjoyable for the livestock. Even with these additions, there was still a major problem that left the livestock emaciated, if not already dead. That problem was time itself. Freight trains move, don't get me wrong, but they still do take multiple days to get from point A to point B. For example, taking into account crew changes, refueling, meets at sidings, it takes just about 2 days for a high priority intermodal train to get from Toronto to Winnipeg, let alone to the end destination of Vancouver or Calgary, for example. It was estimated as early as the mid-1870s that around 120 million pounds of meat was lost in transport. That resulted in around $8 million in revenue lost annually. And that's in 1873. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be in the ballpark of $215 million. Around that time, the state of Illinois passed a law that mandated livestock must be unloaded into pens every 28 hours and the livestock given 5 hours of rest. After easing it in over the course of the 1880s and 90s, this law was passed at a federal level by 1906 through the Meat Inspection Act. Yo, pause. To shorten the trips of animals, they were put on high priority freights right behind the locomotives. Some railroads, like the Erie, allowed handlers to ride the trains in cabooses. This proved to be an effective solution to one problem, but there were still a good few underneath. Another massive change in terms of animal transport happened in the late 1900s when steel cattle cars started popping up. For the first century of livestock transport, the cars were mostly wooden ones. Steel boxes were later widespread, but you could still find wooden boxcars in use right up until the end. New livestock car numbers dropped off as far back as the 40s, leading to railways even into the early 80s like with CN, rebuilding steel or even wood boxcars into livestock cars. This 1970s CP Rail equipment data book shows that some cars rebuilt in the 70s were actually built in the late 50s and even as far back as the late 1920s. Many livestock cars are brown, some were other colors, but notably CN, CP, and even Northern Alberta's cars were two-tone maroonish and white towards the bottom. This was done to give the appearance that they were cleaner than they actually were. They did get clean though. Most of the time, quicklime, a chemical compound used in industrial settings to sanitize, was used to get the gunk and smell out of the car as best as possible. It actually helped stop bacteria from spreading. Now, getting sidetracked here, but other evolutions of the livestock car included these horse cars that transported horses to races. These cars, with around a dozen pens inside, were put on super high priority silk trains that carried time-sensitive shipments like oriental silk and fish. Yeah, like real-life flying kippers. Eventually, there were modified baggage cars used to transport horses, as well as other animals like elephants with circus trains. This lasted with the famous Ringling, Barnum and Bailey Circus until their train was discontinued around 2017. Now, despite the dark nature of this little tidbit, it's still a part of history of these types of cars. During World War II, these cars were used to inhumanely move prisoners of war to concentration camps. Now, this will sound familiar to passenger rail enthusiasts, but the quick evolution of the interstate highway post-World War II led to a decrease in shipping by rail. In terms of passenger trains, we're still feeling the effects, but in terms of freight, it wasn't as drastic. However, profits for livestock shipping took a nosedive in the 50s and 60s. Now I know, I made a video late last year yapping about how much I hate trucks, how better trains are. Still true, but in terms of livestock, trucks have a leg up on trains. Because of the aforementioned issues with animals literally dying in transport on trains, and horse racetracks moving away from rail lines, it seems like producers, farmers, and horse racing leagues took notice and strategically built truck trailers for horses and packing plants closer to farms out in the country along roadways. This drastically decreased shipping times for livestock. By the late 80s, the profits just weren't there when it came to moving livestock by rail. The solution to the early issue of emaciation and death among animals on board by putting the cars on hotshot trains right up front and setting the cars off every 28 hours for the animals to get out and stretch still had the problem of being too time-consuming from an operational standpoint. Not to mention, railways had to hire more people to manage these cars. Just picture this. You get hired on the railway. You made it. But instead of being an engineer or conductor, brakeman, porter, you're shoveling cow pies out of filthy cattle cars. Yeah. There was an entire job dedicated to cleaning out cattle cars. Sounds like fun! Safe to say, I'm sure railroaders back then were glad that position was cut. British Railways changed some policies regarding livestock around 1972, and North America followed the downtrend soon after, and by the late 80s, the majority of livestock cars were taken out of service. A good few were reused in maintenance service going into the 90s, but that didn't last too long either, as many were put out of service for good and sent for scrap in the late 90s. With the fall of these cars as a whole, came the downfall of livestock pens around rail lines. An example close to home is the old Union Stockyard facility in the St. Boniface area of Winnipeg. The massive site was opened in the 1910s and served by the Canadian Pacific, Canadian Northern, and Grand Trunk Pacific Railways. It handled up to 260,000 cattle, 56,000 sheep, and at its peak brought in over $20 million in revenue. However, with the sharp decline of cattle cars, the site shut down in 1988 and was replaced with a modern facility on the outskirts of the city. Most buildings were demolished, while the corner of the site is now an auto rack unloading facility. And as of 2025, the area is being redeveloped for other industries for the new Water Tower district, named after the water tower that still stands as a reminder of what once was. Not all is lost though. Nigeria to this day still runs cattle cars on their network, probably more safe than the cars used decades ago over here. Not to mention, there's a good amount of cattle cars preserved at a good few museums and heritage railways, ranging from narrow gauge Rio Grande cars to standard gauge cars used by Canadian Pacific, the Milwaukee Road, and Santa Fe, just to name a few. Not to mention, from N scale to O scale, cattle cars are available through countless model train companies at hobby shops across North America to add to your collection. All in all, moving livestock by rail was a good idea at first, but it caused more problems than it solved. Of course, I'm not some anti-rail guy posing as a foamer. I still think rail is the best on-land method of transportation, but in this one case, I'd say animals are better off in short distance trips in semis, on their way to the slaughterhouse, Sometimes. Either way, these cars were still a pretty neat part of railroading history. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed, even in the slightest. A huge shout out to the channel members listed right here. Your support means a lot to me and my dog. Of course, another shout out to the people who helped send in photos and videos of these cars. And hey, feel free to join the channel as a member for exclusive content and early access to videos. As always, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more mediocre train content coming your way eventually. This is the Winnipeg Railfan saying be nice in the comments, don't diddle kids, don't derail trains for clout. See you next Tuesday.